No questions about what we did on Monday? Everybody understood that? You got it? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through a very brief review of what we did on Monday, just to emphasize a couple of points and make sure that everything is sort of square in your mind. So what we're talking about and we'll continue to talk about today is really understanding the business cycle or the economic cycle by looking at how it relates to aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And one of the points that we made really clearly, I think, in the last class was really pertaining to the second bullet point and the first that you see here, and that is that economic growth is not a smooth process, meaning you don't get the same growth rate quarter in and quarter out, quarter after quarter after quarter. No, it varies quite a bit. And we know that sometimes we have growth rates that are negative. We end up in recessions. Sometimes we come out of recessions and the economy really surges ahead, as it's doing right now in the United States for reasons, some of which are endogenous, meaning from within the system coming back and people getting rehired, and others of it being exogenous, like the policy mix, which has been so favorable, the fiscal policy, which has given quite a bit of money to households and individuals and small businesses, and some forgiveness of some debts that people have that we've seen. And some of it has to do with monetary policy and the continuing policies of the Fed to suppress interest rates and keep their target policy rate, the federal funds rate, near zero, while pumping $120 billion a month into the banking system. So we know that there are lots of reasons for that. But the key is that growth is not a steady process. Having said that, that second bullet point is important as well, because looking at growth rates over long time periods is really meaningless. And you may recall the example I gave you, thinking about averages, because I said, suppose you had a class where 50% of your grade was on test one and 50% of your grade was on test two, and you got a C on the first exam and an A on the second exam. That doesn't make you a B student. I don't know what it makes you. Do you look at the fact that you saw improvement on the second exam and carry that weight forward? Do you look at the fact that the student was really struggling in the beginning of the semester and that's why the student got a C? But we know that a C and an A averages to a B, but you're not a B student if you got a C and an A. And that's the problem with looking at averages. And so we see that a lot when we look at data over time. And the important thing to focus on here is the right side of the left chart, where you see how growth rates in real GDP over the past 40 years have really smoothed out. And the reason for the smoothing out has a lot to do with the fact that economic policy not only has been better, it has figured out how to deal with inflation. And on the left side of that chart, where you see all the variability in growth rates, a lot of that had to do with variability in inflation rates, and then the Federal Reserve reacting to it, or in many cases not reacting to it, by raising and lowering interest rates. Well, when you have a policy mix that focuses on inflation and keeps that inflation under control, you don't see significant long-term persistent increases in interest rates that tend to slow economic growth, nor do you see persistence on the other side, where the Fed is necessarily keeping interest rates for long time periods at very low levels, because you don't have inflation that you're fighting. And if you're not fighting inflation, you don't have to have variability in the interest rates quite as much. And so you see sort of a smoothing out of the growth rates, particularly over the last 40 years. We looked at different cycles. You see the peaks and the troughs. And here, really, not only am I showing you the different cycles, but I'm emphasizing that point that the averages that you see, especially the very last line of this table, shows you how the averages don't mean very much. When you look at the individual cases, you realize that the duration, depth, and dispersion of every economic cycle is really different. There's a lot of uniqueness to every cycle. So if anybody ever says to you, oh, this is a particularly unique cycle, your response should be, guess what? Every cycle is unique. Every cycle has a different duration, depth, and dispersion. So saying that the cycle is unique, yeah, every cycle is unique. They all have their own individual characteristics. Now, part of the reason why these cycles are so different is that different economies grow persistently at different rates for different reasons. And we know that the policy mix certainly matters a lot. We know that the fundamentals of growth matter. And, if you walk out of this semester and you don't have rattling around in your brain, that old man Mallon kept talking about the quality and quantity of labor and the quality and quantity of capital and the use of modern technologies and modern management techniques, and also talk about productivity and all of that. If that's not rattling around your brain at the end of May, all the way into June, when this course is long forgotten by you, but it's buried in your brain, then I guess I haven't done my job. But the fundamentals of growth are shown right in front of you, and that's why some economies grow persistently. Let's face it, some economies are better structured to take advantage of the things that you see in front of you. In some economies, we train our labor better, and there's more of that labor. We have better, newer, more modern technologies and management practices, and that factors into the capital supply, etc. We know that the most progressive economies in the world are the ones that realize that foreign markets are critically important. So we talk a lot about trade, but we also talk about supply chains. And that, of course, came to the fore a lot when we heard about the problem in the Suez Canal the last few weeks, where you had a gigantic ship loaded with tradable goods stacked up as high as any. I mean, it's one of the biggest cargo ships in the world. And instead of going down the Suez Canal, it went across it. It stopped all that transshipment of goods and services and commodities like oil. If that didn't remind us just how important foreign trade is and foreign connections are, then nothing does. And yet, as the world economy is growing and growing, and the International Monetary Fund came out yesterday and raised its forecast for economic growth around the world to an average of 6% globally for this particular year, you understand how we ran out of semiconductors, how we ran out of computer chips. And if you run out of those chips and more of the things you produce are electronic, like automobiles, then you can't produce the cars. And again, it just shows you how this stuff, which is produced all over the world, becomes part of a global chain that makes economic growth possible. Entrepreneurial cultures matter a lot. The countries that really support entrepreneurial cultures, like the United States, really do well. Now, there are exceptions. The entrepreneurial culture being built into China certainly helped to propel Chinese growth. Now that entrepreneurial culture is being stifled a bit by an authoritarian government that favors, in many ways, state-owned enterprises, and still, because of peculiarities and uniqueness of the Chinese economic, political, and financial system, China is still going to grow this year over 8%. But all in all, where you see an entrepreneurial culture, that's what capitalism is about. They tend to do very well, because if you have an entrepreneurial culture, you have to have lending going on to these businesses. And where these businesses get their funds, the price they pay, the availability of those funds really makes a difference. I'm sorry for personalizing this, but when I give you personal examples, I think it's because I think they illustrate a point we're making. I see it with my son's business. My son has a relatively small business in Central Florida, and it's doing so well that he ran out of money. In order to expand, he needed more money. He had to find sources of funding. He found those sources of funding. Dad, he found those sources of funding, and his business was able to grow. So sometimes the connection between the entrepreneurial culture and the financial system becomes really important. And of course, you need modern infrastructure, and infrastructure is on the minds of everybody in Washington now that the Biden administration has put forward an infrastructure plan. You need good roads, you need good ports, you need good airports, you need good telecommunication systems, you need 5G. 5G now, we don't even know where its successor is going to come from. You need an electric power grid that comes in, that is totally reliable. All of these things are part of the infrastructure. The countries that have it do well. The countries that don't have it don't. And you even see it within our own system. I mean, how many of you, and there were many, sent me emails during and even after your first exam saying, I'm really sorry about turning in my exam late, but my internet just bowed out on me and I'm stuck. I mean, I got a message like that from somebody who is actually, I know you're listening because I saw your name pop up. Someone sent me an email just a couple of days ago saying that that happened to him taking an exam from another course, that his internet gave out. And then when he went to go back, he was locked out of the exam. And so even within a modern city like New York, the infrastructure can be imperfect. So infrastructure certainly matters. We know that recessions have been caused by a lot of different things, shocks of different sizes and scope, and we'll get into that in a moment, but a lot of it is really caused by the policies of central banks and governments, and oftentimes it's to fight inflation. You fight inflation, you got to raise interest rates. You fight inflation, you got to stop the growth of bank reserves, which then turn into the money supply. If you don't do that, you don't fight inflation. So keeping inflation under control has been critical to avoiding recessions because obviously it's entirely possible that the fight against inflation can cause a recession. And it's happened many times, even in the United States. So it's something we watch carefully. But we know that there are economic, financial, political, geopolitical disturbances that cause all kinds of problems around the world in individual countries and stifle their economic growth. Look at what's happening now in terms of um, Western Europe. Western Europe is in lockdowns again. You know, people can go out only to get necessities of life, medicines and food and that in several major European countries. Why? Because people didn't get vaccinated, either because the government fouled it up or because they chose not to do it or because they were not wearing masks or they were not social distancing. People with hard heads who chose to believe the conspiracy theorists rather than the scientists and made the unfortunate errors that not only could and in many cases did affect their own health, affected the health of other people, and forced their governments to take steps that were generic for everybody. So what happened? Those who did all the right things, got vaccinated, wear masks, social distance, they pay the price for the people who have been disrespectful of the science. In New York, you can now get vaccinated at age 16. I sincerely hope that every single one of you considers carefully getting vaccinated ASAP. That's my own political statement. I'm sorry, I shouldn't inject it. But to me, it's so patently obvious. There's no reason not to do that. We talked about long waves, and we said that long waves tend to be in the area of 50 years, and you can have short waves within the long waves, those we call economic or business cycles. And often those long waves are associated with major changes in technologies that tend to be disruptive. And I made the argument to you now that you are in the early stages of a very positive wave of disruptive technologies that could last us for decades, that will totally change the ways in which we live and work and play and spend our leisure time in general. All of these things are worth keeping in mind because it should be in thinking about the occupations you choose to go into, the kinds of training you get and you master, and of course, when you're fortunate enough, if you're not already, to think about how you save and invest your money, because the world of 20 years from now is going to be a very different world from the world of 2021. Almost finished with the review. We talked about leading, coincident, and lagging indicators. Leading indicators foretell what's to come. Coincident indicators reveal where we are. And lagging indicators really suggest where we have come from. And we look at them very carefully as ways of trying to assess in a shorthand way without looking at hundreds of different indicators, whether they be soft data or hard data, where we are, because they tend to move as indicators before the overall economic cycle coincident with the economic cycle or after the economic cycle. So if you're coming out of a recession and you've hit the trough and the economy is already growing, a lagging indicator will start to go up after the trough. Okay? And here's how we ended. We ended by taking a look at econometric models and how they relate to crises. And I hope you read this slide very carefully because it really states something which is sort of the state of the art of thinking of macroeconomists nowadays. And that is, yes, you have to model the economy to get a sense of relationships among variables and to get a sense of really how you can forecast. The problem is that those relationships are based upon things that come from the past. But if you are, let's say, in the midst of the greatest economic the economic revolution and technological revolution the world has ever seen, and we are, then those past relationships may not necessarily hold. And how people behave in response to different circumstances can be very, very different. So if you look at just the red language and you start at the end of let's start at the beginning. The future waits not for its contents to be discovered, but for that content to be originated. In other words, if you think that the future is going to be reflective of the past, you're going to be wrong because the future is going to be totally unique, totally something that originates anew. Anyone who says to you, anyone who, the famous quote from Santa Anna who said, I'm paraphrasing, that failure to understand the past. I don't even remember what it said. I'm sorry. But it suggested that, that if you don't understand what happened in the past, you're doomed to failure in the future. That's not true. Not anymore. A crisis is not an equilibrium state. A crisis is not something in the design of a model, but rather something that emerges in a way not built into a model. The future is not something that you can build into a model. The model has to break. It has to move into a realm that doesn't follow a predetermined path. Nor is a crisis simply a draw from a fat tail, a bad draw from an urn. Think about that for a minute. Every crisis is not something that you say, well, okay, it happens from time to time. We've seen these things before. It's not. It's something that is completely new. And as a consequence, it's a draw from a new urn, a new distribution, and one that cannot be predetermined. In other words, we don't know exactly where things are going to go. So trying to forecast the future, yes, you have to do that. You have to try to forecast the future. Try, but recognize that those forecasts are always going to be really soft. Here's a wonderful example, something that I got today. It's from an article just published today by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and I love this. Predictable outcomes, how households will use their stimulus checks based upon the stimulus from this past June, this past January, and just last month. I don't know about you, but I don't know that I would have forecasted, or my models would have forecasted this, that the average percentage of the stimulus checks that was spent, do you believe this? Somewhere around a quarter of it was spent, and that I guess I would have forecast that with each stimulus check, the amount spent would have dropped, and it did from 29.2 down to 24.7. But look at this. The share of it that's being saved is almost half, 2/5, 41.6%. And that I would have guessed that more of it would have been spent on paying down debt. I guess what I'm saying to you is, I don't know if these numbers surprise you. They surprise me. It's not anything that past stimulus packages, if we had used those as guides to what people would do with their money, I don't think you would have come up with these numbers. I don't know about you. Did you think, especially given your circle of friends and family, your community, whatever it is, that nationally only about a quarter of the stimulus money got spent? Because most people would say, I don't know, I needed that stimulus money. I spent all of it. Maybe in your community or in your household or you yourself. But nationally, only a quarter of it? I wouldn't have forecast that. So this makes the point that forecasting can be very perilous because, and maybe more important of all, could the Biden administration have forecast this? And did they? I don't know if they did. I don't know what their numbers are. I don't see anything coming out of their Office of Management and Budget. I haven't seen anything. But these are actual data calculated by the New York Fed. I would think that the Biden administration forecast that that front line, top line, average percentage spent would have been higher than 24.7. I don't know that to be a fact, but I would have guessed that that's what they would have thought. And that's what their models would have ground out. So before we go on to new stuff, which will actually be really fast because you've actually seen this stuff before, the importance of learning the early part of the course, you'll see it in a minute. Do you have any questions about this summary of where we were in the last class? Took 20 minutes. No questions?
Professor?
Yes, sir.
Will this be the last topic that's on the test? The chapter 13?
Question, because that's really, come on, man. We're not talking about the test now. We'll talk about the test, as I said in the beginning of the class, at the end of the test.
I'll ask it at the end.
This
And also
doesn't belong. Your question doesn't belong here.
Okay,
I
another question I
respect the
have.
fact that you're asking a question. I encourage questions.
Okay, another
But your
question I had was.
question in this spot is not. Your question in this spot is inappropriate.
I understand that. Another question I had was, wouldn't the Biden administration have seen that the percentage spent was only percent in June, and wouldn't they have been able to predict it by January or March that it was going to be something like that with the second and third stimulus checks?
I'm sure that they took, I'm sure that they took the information they got from data pertaining to the June stimulus and factored that into their models. I'm pretty sure. And I'm pretty sure that what that did was it set them up to say, well, if only less than 30% of the money was spent with the first stimulus, probably we're not looking at 40 or 50 or 60% being spent in January and March. I'm sure that's in their models. But would they have forecast that the number would have dropped continually? So again, from 29 down to 24? I don't know. As I said, I don't know what the Office of Management and Budget had. Your question is a good one because it's sensitive to the fact that all new information should be factored into modern modeling. I would guess that that's right. But you know what? Between June and March, the economy changed a lot. And one of the things that did happen was the unemployment rate, particularly among people who are still out of work, who tend to be service workers, who tend to be relatively lower paid, is still relatively high. So you would have forecast that that segment of the population would have been spending a very large percentage of it. But the fact that less than a quarter of the money got spent nationally, when we know that there has not been mortgage payment forgiveness, there hasn't been nationally rent forgiveness, we know that indebtedness has increased, we know that student borrowing has gone up, and what's more, to flip it around, we know that there has been a huge surge in retail sales. Amazon, for example, is going great. We're manufacturing about 100% capacity. We can't turn out enough goods. So people are spending. We're seeing inflation numbers, especially in retail, start to edge up. So we know people are spending. We know the housing market has gotten very, very tight. So we know that there is more production. We know there's more spending. We know that there has been more hiring in general. The unemployment rate has come down. We know that people have been spending money and that they've spent on big ticket items. We know furniture. You can't buy a mattress. You can't find mattresses in mattress stores. We know furniture has flown out of stores. All of that put together, and yet we've seen a shrinkage in that. I don't know that if their models accounted for that, but I would be shocked if they aren't shocked to some extent. But again, I haven't seen anything coming out of the Office of Management and Budget, so I don't know. But your question is really good, and I'm grateful for it. And so we'll take your
Okay, thank
question
you.
about the exam at the end of the test. I'm
Okay, yeah,
sorry, at
I
the
will.
end of the class. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, let's go. So what's an aggregate demand curve? Guess what? We've seen this in many forms before. You remember MV equals PY? And I said that MV is sort of aggregate demand or aggregate spending. Think of the MV as being spending. Think of the PY as being earnings. There you go. So we've seen this before. And it has to do with that quantity theory of money. MV equals PY. This is what we've talked about. If money growth is 5% and velocity is 0, then real growth is 3 and inflation is 2, meaning the left side, 5 plus 0, has to equal the right side of the equation, 3 plus 2. So it's all the combinations of inflation and real growth consistent with a specified amount of spending growth. It's all the combinations of P and Y consistent with what's on the left side, growth in M and growth in V. We've seen all this before, and that's what this chart shows you, all the combinations. So it's almost like a line. So this is a budget line of MV. 5 plus 0 is what the past slide talked about, and it shows you all the combinations of M plus V along the blue line or the blue curve, consistent with growth in inflation and growth in the real GDP. MV equals PY. M dot, or the growth in M plus the growth in V, must equal the growth in P plus the growth in Y. Exactly what we talked about. Here's what we didn't get to, though. Suppose we see shifts in aggregate demand. Suppose the aggregate demand curve moves. Suppose there is a shift in M dot plus V dot. And suppose it increases or decreases. If it decreases, you shift that entire budget line to the left. If it increases, you move it to the right. That's what we see here. Okay? So this doesn't show us anything we don't know before. Now, that's all on the demand side, but what about on the supply side? And here we have to pause for a moment because we know that the aggregate supply curve, the total amount of goods and services out on the market for sale, notice I said goods and services, is going to be sensitive to the real economic growth rate and to the inflation rate. Well, let's just back up for a moment. Let's think about the inflation rate. You all took in Economics 101 class. You know that a supply curve is upward sloping, meaning the higher the price goes, the more sellers are willing and able to put out on the market for sale. That's why a supply curve, when you did supply and demand, is upward sloping. Well, it's the same sort of idea here. If businesses could get more for what they are selling, you would expect them to put more out on the market for sale. That would be your expectation normally. Are there exceptions to that? There are many exceptions to that, and we'll talk about some of that perhaps later. So in the short run, you would expect an aggregate supply curve to be upward sloping if you look at price or inflation versus quantity supplied. What about aggregate demand? Well, of course, because if real GDP is growing more, it means you are producing more output. It also means that there is more aggregate spending, national income and product account. And of course, if your economy is stronger, sellers are going to want to put more out on the market for sale. What did I say just a couple of minutes ago? You can't find a mattress in stores. Why? Because the economy surged with all of the fiscal and monetary stimulus. The housing market expanded, and when people buy new homes, very often they change the mattresses that they sleep on. In addition, there are more homes. So maybe somebody has a home, but they buy a second home. So maybe they have an apartment in Queens and they buy a home in Florida. Well, they keep the mattress they have in Queens, but they have to buy a mattress for their home in Florida. So with more and more housing activity consistent with a stronger economy, you're going to see more output put out on the market for sale. In the short run, I hope that makes sense to you. But here's the deal. What about a long run aggregate supply curve? And we've addressed this too, because in the long run, those things that I just talked with you about, prices going up, so they want to put more out on the market for sale, the economy being stronger, so yeah, they want to meet demand, so they put more out on the market for sale. But in the long run, the potential sustainable growth rate of the economy doesn't depend on inflation, and it doesn't depend in the short run on short run factors in the economy. What does it depend on? It depends on productivity gain, and it depends upon the labor input. Oh my goodness, we've talked about this before. And so, how do we begin to frame this so that it makes sense? Well, look at that long run average supply curve, the vertical line. It's vertical, meaning when the economy is growing at 3%, the long run average aggregate supply curve is totally insensitive to the inflation rate. Totally insensitive. It's vertical. Elasticity, zero. Totally inelastic with respect to the inflation rate. Non-elastic. Thank you, Sujan. Exactly right. Look at the short run aggregate supply curve. It is upward sloping, exactly as you would expect. As the inflation rate rises, you would expect more goods and services to be put out on the market for sale. And guess what? As the economy grows, you would expect there to be more goods and services put out on the market for sale because there's more demand for it. So the short run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. The assumption here is that you have a constant expected inflation rate of 2%. And if that constant expected inflation rate is 2%, then you would expect the aggregate demand curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, and the long run aggregate supply curve all to intersect at that inflation rate. Eminently logical. So there you go. Long run aggregate supply curve, determinants, the labor input and productivity, and then ultimately, where is long run aggregate supply going to go? It's going to go to the growth rate, which we call the Solow growth rate. Guess what? The growth rate dictated by growth theory. Now, so of course, Solow looked at capital and labor in his model, but capital is the thing that promotes productivity growth. And we've talked about productivity growth being a function of capital stock. And how much capital stock do you add? You keep adding until the marginal product of capital becomes zero. And that occurs when all you're doing is replacing depreciated capital. And there you go. So the Solow growth model creeps into this right here. All things we've seen before, all things you have mastered, all things you're going to knock dead on your second exam, I'm sure. So I'm going to skip this because it's sort of, all of this really just reiterates stuff I've just said. Okay, so shifts in the long run aggregate supply curve. Sometimes we see a shift because of shocks in the economy that are real shocks, total changes in economic conditions. And one of them is going on right now, ladies and gentlemen. That shock that we're seeing is pretty much every day you turn around and you hear about some kind of new technology that's being launched. Here's a perfect example. Today's Wall Street Journal, huge article, starts on page 1 about how China is the first major economy in the world to introduce a cryptocurrency. The Chinese money supply is called yuan or renminbi. So yuan or yuan, Y-U-A-N. Just like dollar bills, it consists in a tangible form. Well, guess what? There are going to be digital yuan. Now, we've talked about cryptocurrencies before. Cryptocurrencies didn't become invented in April of 2021, but to have a major economy, maybe the largest, if not the second largest economy in the world, institute a digital currency for a variety of reasons, that's a major change. You know what it says? Other economies are going to be shortly right behind it. Major change in how economics and finance is going to be paid out in payment systems. But guess what? You know, think about all the things that Elon Musk is doing. It's not just the Tesla automobile. It's not just his ventures into outer space. It's not just the advancements that Musk's company is making into lithium-based batteries and the like. All of these things are changing the way in which we live and work because let's face it, 20 years from now, I can assure you that you will be in places and you're going to turn on the lights and guess what? The electricity won't be provided by Con Edison. The electricity is going to be provided by some battery pack that's in the basement of the building where you turned on the lights. It's going to be a battery pack. And Con Edison is going to have to start looking for new ways to make money because more and more people are not going to be turning onto an electric grid. Either they're going to be getting it from solar panels or some such thing, or they're going to be getting it from a battery pack or some combination of them. Maybe the
Professor?
solar panel creates the electricity, which gets fed into and gets stored in a battery pack. And there you go. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah, I got a question. So the cryptocurrency or the currency that China wanted to implement, or have they already done
Not
that?
wanting, they are. They are putting it into effect.
Is it as volatile as other cryptocurrencies?
I'm sorry, is it what?
Is it as volatile as other cryptocurrencies?
Well, remember, they haven't launched it yet. And we don't know whether or not it's going to have any kind of intrinsic value. I mean, you trade bitcoins. Bitcoin has an intrinsic value, meaning it's used to make transactions, but the Bitcoin itself has value, as you know. I don't know that the yuan is going to have an intrinsic value. I suspect that it will not, in which case it won't be volatile. It'll have a, in other words, the currency itself will have no value. What it represents in terms of 100 yuan or 1,000 yuan, that's where the value is, much the same way as your dollar bill does. Your dollar bill, that greenback that you may have in your wallet, it may say $1. It's worth $1 in transactions, but the cloth on which it's printed has no value. You know, you can't do anything with it. You can't write on it. It won't do anything. If you burn it, it won't give you a lot of heat and light. So it doesn't have any value in and of itself. I suspect that that's what's going to happen in the yuan cryptocurrency. But do I know that yet? No, it hasn't been. They have not specified yet whether this will be a tradable asset that one could hold, not just because of what it represents in terms of value in transactions, but whether or not it has some intrinsic value that you hold because it becomes an asset. That is not a 0% asset, like Bitcoin is not a 0% asset. We don't know yet.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So what we're going to be doing for the remainder of our time really is really nothing terribly new, nothing that you haven't seen before. You know, a negative shock, of course, will shift the supply curve to the left, and a positive shock will shift it to the right. Obviously, new technologies are positive shocks, but let's say the huge, yeah, this is a good example. Let's say we have gigantic fires again in California that burns down cities, like happened last year, except make it an even bigger scale. That's a permanent shock to the California economy. That's a negative shock that could take the entire long run aggregate supply curve of the U.S. and shift it to the left. Now, the next two slides are extremely important for you to understand. The beauty of the next two slides is they have great explanations. There should be no ambiguity in your mind about what these slides are showing and why, because the explanations are wonderful. I should tell you that the next two slides came out of the textbook that I use when I teach Economics 101. That should be no insult to you at all. It's that it came out of an Economics 101 textbook, as is the slide that you see in front of you. But the explanation is wonderful, and so let's take a look at it. What it says is, okay, suppose we have a fall in aggregate demand. What it could do is induce a lengthy recession, and let's see why. So I'm just going to read it to you. So first, take a look at the two curves, the blue one and the red one. Remember that these are budget lines, M plus V. The combination of M dot, or the growth in M plus the growth in V, must be equal to the growth in the inflation rate plus the growth in real GDP. So, at point A, spending is growing at a rate of 10%, real growth is 3%, and inflation is 7%. Okay? So if M plus V equals 10%, then real growth plus inflation must equal 10%, and it's making an assumption of 3 and 7. Suppose spending growth decreases to 5%, meaning the blue curve shifts inward to become the pink or the red curve. It shifts inward so that the growth in M plus the growth in V, instead of equaling 10%, equals 5%. What that means to you is somehow the inflation rate plus the real growth rate must sum to 5%. In this example, you have an inflation rate of 6 and a real growth rate of -1. Why? Because in the short run, wages are sticky, meaning they don't move in the short run. Think about it. You're working somewhere, whether it's doesn't matter whether you're working in a supermarket or you're working for Goldman Sachs, it doesn't make a difference. You know, if business turns down in the short run, they're not going to cut your wages immediately. And by the way, most people don't get changes in their compensation more than like once a year. I mean, if you work at Goldman Sachs, let's say, your comp is done every January or February. That's when comp is determined. So here you are in April, and if Goldman is not doing as well as it was doing in the previous quarter, they're not going to cut your salary. So wages tend to be sticky. So in the short run, wages are sticky. So although spending growth has declined, yeah, it declined from 10% to 5%. So although spending growth declines, wage growth doesn't. So as a result, real growth falls to -1% and the inflation rate falls to 6%. The company has to continue to pay its wages because wages are sticky, but spending has gone down, so obviously real growth has gone down. In the long run, wages unstick. Yeah, I mean, eventually you're going to get to the point where the company is going to say, all right, well, we're not doing as well as we were before, and it's time for us to adjust wages. They will unstick their wages. Wages become unstuck. The economy will move to a new long-run equilibrium at C. Getting to the point can take a lengthy recession. So what begins to happen is that you move along that red curve to, as wages unstick, people begin to spend more, and because you are in a recession, the inflation rate comes down and you end up at C. Compare A to C. At A, you had an inflation rate of 7 and real growth of 3. At C, you have real growth of C. You go back to the long-run supply curve, but the inflation rate is lower. This is exactly how economies tend to move. And so understanding this particular slide should be, is really important. And I hope you'll take time to read through it, understand each of the individual sentences. And if you don't, When we meet again on Monday, be sure to ask me questions. Another example, what about an economic recovery? You get more economic growth and more inflation typically when you get economic recovery. Hey, look at what's happening now, ladies and gentlemen. The economy is growing faster, and the talk all over the place with gigantic question marks is, do we have more inflation? Are we going to get more inflation? Everybody knows the inflation rate's gone up. Everybody knows that it will exceed the Fed's target of 2%. It'll get above 2%, which the Fed is not uncomfortable with. They would like to see it at, somewhat above 2%, 2.25, 2.3, somewhere like that. But that's consistent with more economic growth. Why? Didn't I say to you, you can't find a mattress? So if you're in the mattress business, you're going to jack up your prices. Didn't I say that the housing market is red hot? Yeah. People putting houses on the market for sale, they're asking $700,000 or $800,000 for it, and they're getting bids at $50,000 and $900,000 because people want those houses. So they're getting money way above what their asking price is in many parts of the country. That's inflationary. You look at what it costs to ship something. There are no shipping containers out there, ladies and gentlemen, to ship something from point A to point B. And when a shipping container comes due, those who need to ship something, they're paying a premium price for it. Have you gone to the gas station? Look at what's happened to the price of gasoline, approaching $3 a gallon. It wasn't many months ago when it was closer to $2.25. So we're looking at this. There's some inflation in the system, no doubt about it, as the economy is growing. And now, even though apparently people are spending only about a quarter of what they're getting in their stimulus checks, hey, that's still a lot of money. That's still a lot of new spending that's out there. On top of it, there's a lot of pent-up demand. So when it's pent-up demand for goods, it will show up in goods prices. Pent-up demand for services, well, you see it in some, you don't see it in others. So for example, let's face it, people may have pent-up demand for haircuts, but once they get that first haircut because their hair had grown really shaggy and they didn't want it anymore, they're going to wait some time before they take their next haircut. But you know what's happening to airplane ticket prices? Up and up and up because the demand for travel has just exceeded everybody's expectations. People have gotten into the airports far more frequently than expected. I've got trips coming up. I've booked trips, coming up. I've got a trip coming up, in just a few days. I've got another one at the end of April. I just booked a trip for November to go to London to an event. I'll probably be booking a trip to Asia based on for business. Ladies and gentlemen, the prices of those tickets is going up. So when the economy is growing faster, you tend to see more inflationary pressures. Because if you want something and there are bottlenecks and capacity to produce is at 100%, they can't produce anymore, businesses are going to jack up their prices. So in the long run, the short run average supply curve shifts upward, which is what you would expect, as inflation expectations adjust and wages become unstuck, exactly what we talked about in the previous slide. As a result, real growth will eventually return to the solo growth rate. Of course it will, because that's the potential capacity of the economy as given by the long run average aggregate supply curve, and inflation will increase. In the long run, after all transitions are complete, the economy will end up at point C. You'll end up with a higher inflation rate. But in the long run, you have to adhere to what long run aggregate growth will be as determined by productivity and your labor input. And that solo growth model becomes relevant. And so you end up with an economy that in the long run goes right back to what the solo model would predict, except with a higher inflation rate. That's what happens in the long run. So you can see a surge. You can see the U.S. economy growing, say, in the second half of this year at some numbers we haven't seen in a long time, 6%, 7%, maybe 8%. But over the long haul, we're going to go back to being a 2.75% growth economy, because that's the growth in productivity and that's the growth in the labor force that we see over the long term. And that's what's going to determine where that long run aggregate supply curve will hang out. Now, there will be from time to time, there are going to be shocks that will shift the curves over. And these shocks, can be positive or negative, as this points out to us. And they can take many different forms. And some of them can even be associated with recession. So what I'm going to do now is basically end our class today, even though it's only 11:37, by just focusing on a couple of different things. Positive shocks. They come from many different places. I talked with you earlier today and a little bit more last class about oil shocks, how oil shocks in 1973, in 1979, 1973, associated with an oil embargo coming out of Middle Eastern states. 1979, I'm sorry, that was associated with the Yom Kippur War. 1979, associated with what took place, particularly with Iran and the Iranian Revolution that brought that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini into power. We saw shortages of oil, and those shortages of oil meant a lot because on a per capita basis, we just used way more oil than we use now. Now, if you get an oil shock, it matters. It just doesn't matter as much. So it could be from oil. It could be from weather. But you know what? We have figured out we're a lot better at dealing with these kinds of negative shocks from weather. Just look at what happened, say, in Houston when they had that cold shock, or the fires in California, which we hope won't happen again, but I'm afraid they will. One of my students told me that her family's house burned down in one of those fires, which was really, really very, very sad story. But what it does, these negative shocks, is all the things that you see in front of you. But you can have positive shocks. We've talked about technology. We've talked about even shocks to the system being caused by unexpected and very large changes in economic policy, which is what we're seeing now. We can see positive shocks. Let's say relations between two countries were cold, and then all of a sudden they've sort of heated up a little bit, and countries start doing more business with each other than they did before. Look at some of the changes going on now in the Middle East involving Israel and some countries that historically had been at least Cold War, if not hot war, enemies of Israel. And now the trade is improving and taking place. Great examples. Positive shocks like that. Or countries that change their economic system that may go from, say, a socialist to a non-socialist system, causing their economy to grow much faster. All of these things can have really big effects. And in the end, they would shift or contribute to a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve and potentially could shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. Very, very important things for you to consider. Look, I'll just end with this. I think I mentioned this I know I did. I mentioned this in our class on Monday, and it's a very important point. And I pointed out to you that what I'm about to reiterate to you is something I've written about. I mean, I've published on this particular theme. You're in the midst of the greatest technological revolution the world has ever seen. Never have you seen a technological revolution in history that is going to be, and already is, more disruptive. That said, one of the things that the world is facing is a shortage of qualified labor, meaning labor that will be able to step in and take advantage of and promote the technological and other changes that are taking place in global economies. I would argue, however, that there is a solution to this, and it is well known, and some countries, and I put the US among them, are already jumping onto this bandwagon. And that is, the way to solve the shortage of labor may not be through immigration, which is where it has taken place historically. In the United States, for decades now, all labor supply growth has come from immigration because the birth rate and the death rate are roughly equal to each other. Even that has changed. The birth rate is actually now slower in the US than the death rate. People are living longer because medical care has just gotten so much better. But that said, if you need to have a bigger and more improved labor force, the way to deal with it is to deal with people who are underemployed. And the single largest group of underemployed people in the United States, and really, I would argue globally, are women. How do I know they're the biggest group? Because they're 50% of the population. As more and more and more women become more and more fully integrated into the global economy in higher level positions and at pay comparable to that of men, you will see massive, massive growth in potential GDP because that will show up in productivity. And you will see a global economic boom not like nothing the world has ever seen. That's ahead of us. I'm not saying it happens this year or next year. That's ahead of us. And it's a spectacular outcome. That would be a positive shock that would push the that will push the long-term aggregate supply curve to the right. What that will say is that sustained real economic growth in the world, as measured by GDP, will rise on a permanent basis. And it won't just be that the biggest countries in the world account for the biggest amount of growth. You know, the biggest transfer of wealth that the world has ever seen took place over the past 30 years, and it had nothing to do with oil. It had to do with a shift of economic growth and power and wealth from the developed market world to the less developed market world. That shift will continue, but it will slow up, and you will see a resurgence of the developed market world who will take advantage of the technological revolution and will take advantage of that mass pool of underemployed people. And I would argue that that's women. I hope that occurs. I expect it to occur because, well, I'll just leave it like that. I have a daughter. So I will stop here. It's a quarter to 12. And Ahmed, you had a question about the exam. So why don't we take your question first? You still with us, Ahmed?
Yeah.
What was your question?
Actually, I think I got it now. It's not a big deal.
Why don't you ask it though, so it might help other people to answer the question.
I was gonna say the topics on the test, is it like up until this point or what we were doing the review before?
The exam covers all the materials since the beginning of the semester through the work we did on money and money supply and the Federal Reserve. In other words, what we did on Monday and what we're doing today is not on the exam.
So chapter 12?
Honestly, I don't remember chapter numbers. So by topic,
Okay.
you
All
know,
right.
again, if you
Okay.
need the chapter numbers, it's all in the syllabus.
Okay, thank you.
So the exam will be posted at 7 p.m. today. The reason it's 7 p.m. is that my other class is it's a once a week 2-hour class from 5 to 7. Once that class is over, the exam will be posted. They will have their exam posted, which is different from yours. You will have your exam posted, and you will have until 10 p.m. on Sunday, April 11th, to submit the exam. I promise you, and I'm not being difficult. Honestly, I'm not trying to be difficult or a pain in the butt, but I will not accept any exams after 10 p.m. on Sunday. If you send the exam and I get it at 10:01, it's going to get a 0. Please don't do that. If I were you, I would send the exam at 9 o'clock or at 8 o'clock so that you don't take any chances. But I promise you, I am going to give a grade of 0 to any exam turned in after 10 p.m. on Sunday. You have more than enough time to do this exam. There's no reason for it to be late. Someone just typed in a question about the exam. The exam will be available on Blackboard, in the content area where you have everything else. So it will be there, on Blackboard. Just give me a moment. Someone just posed the question. Once it's started, all 100 questions have to be done in one setting, right? No, my goodness, I wouldn't expect you to sit down and do 100 questions in one setting. I mean, if I were you, I would think I would do this in 4 segments of 25. So maybe you do, 25 tomorrow and, 25, 25 Saturday night and maybe 25 Sunday morning and 25 Sunday afternoon and be finished. But I don't recommend that you sit down and try to do all 100 in one professor. Is the method of the final, is the method, whoops. Oh. Is the method of the final exam the same as the exam or do it on class time? The final exam, there is a 2 hour and 15 minute period that is allotted to this class by the school, not by me, not by the economics department. So the exam will start at whatever hour. You will then have 2 hours and 15 minutes to get your answers to me. Your final exam will be shorter than this second exam because I can't ask you to do 100 questions in 2 hours and 15 minutes. So, okay. I knew you couldn't be the professor to do 100 exams in one sitting. I don't understand what that is. So, do you have any other questions? Now, in the posting that I've already put on Blackboard, I said that I thought that it would be fair to say that you should allocate roughly or think about allocating 4 hours to do this exam. I think that constitutes 2 thoughts on my mind. One is to answer the questions, and then the second one is to take some time to review the answers you have, because there may be places where you're not sure of your answer and you want to look it up. This is a take-home test. I'm assuming you're going to have books open. I'm assuming that you're going to look at PowerPoint slides. I assume that you may even listen to recordings. I don't care. It's a take-home test. I want you to. The reason why there are so many questions, ladies and gentlemen, is I want this to be a learning exercise. Specifically, if I could have confidence that you would walk out of my class knowing 100 facts, the facts relevant to each of these questions, and I said my class learned 100 facts, I'd be a pretty happy dude. So think of it as a long homework assignment. It's what I want you to learn. I want you to learn from the answers from these questions and the answers to them, some of which you'll have to sit there and you'll scratch your head and you'll go, what? Where's he going with this? What does he want? I don't remember doing this in class. That's fine. Go look it up. This is a learning exercise. And it's a real chance for you to boost your grades that you got on that first exam, because you've got a lot of time to do this. You have tonight, you have all day Monday, you have Saturday. For some of you, it's all day Saturday. For some of you, it may just be Saturday evening. You have all day Sunday. For some of you, it may be part of Sunday. You have a lot of time to do this exam. Get it right. Get a high grade on this test. Okay? And if you do, that final exam is going to be easy. Okay? So that's it. Unless you have any other questions, I'm going to say goodbye. wish you lots and lots of luck on this exam and hope that you do well. And I thank you, Ahmed, for your questions and for your participation today. It was really very helpful to the class and to me. I hope it was helpful to you. That's it. Okay. Goodbye. Happy days and best of luck.
Excuse me, Prof.